The game we're going to be looking at today is LUMO. It's an old style retro looking platform and it is very much a callback to that old 1980s style of isometric platforming that was around with the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 days. It's simple in appearance and very much designed to break your heart as much as it is your controller and how it plays. This is a callback to design when games weren't easy at all. There was no simple way to progress. This was the time when difficulty was both intended and a product of bad game design, and LUMO feels very much the heir apparent to that kind of old gameplay. It's simple in design yet labyrinthine in execution, and while we're going to be looking at it today from both a modern perspective and a retro perspective, I do wonder if LUMO actually honours that old style of play in many ways through design, or it's more of a case of does it actually attempt to evolve the media and that old isometric style of platforming beyond what we're used to, or just give a definitively hard gameplay experience because that's what was expected from a game back then, just with a slightly bit more of polish, and the graphics side is what we get from today's final product. And as a reminder before we go on, giveaways are still going on in videos. I'm slightly retooling them a bit, so now it's just be a subscriber and leave a comment. That's simple, no more fuss, more details at the end of the video. Getting back onto LUMO, it's a game that very much wants to hit you in nostalgia. For those gamers who are very much 25 and above, if not 30 to 35, are going to be right at home with this kind of design. It really speaks to old games going back generations, looking at stuff like Snake Rattle and Roll, Marble Madness, Cuba, the really old guard of video games, and some you'll be familiar with and some you won't be, and this game is full of references to those series as well, and along with modern day devices all make an actual stand in this game as well as being pointed first and foremost. If you can pick up all the little Easter eggs and hat tips that are in this game, great, but if not, it doesn't matter. You might just learn something on the way, but it's not fundamental to the experience. The experience is a platform with a nice dash of humour and nostalgia on the side, and I think it works really well. LUMO is simplistic at best, but works in a way that slowly evolves your skills over time by giving you bits and pieces to help you go through. It's not a game like Metroid where you find yourself going down a dungeon one way until you can get no further with an upgrade. There are upgrades in LUMO, but they're first and foremost just a simple way to help guide you through to the next level of challenge. Your character in LUMO starts off with the ability to do very little. You're giving a jumping ability which then lets you know that platforming's all go, and there are a couple of other minor upgrades that you get later on in the game, but outside of that, this is pure platforming and really pure puzzling as well to a degree too. It's a puzzle platformer, but a platformer foremost, and for the most part it's a platformer with extreme difficulty levels as we go further on, and I'll let you decide for yourself should you play it if you think these are more design based or just a product of bad design. Well, we'll explore it later anyway, but let's talk about the story itself. And fundamentally it's nice to actually have a game story to cover here that isn't actually long and engrossing. LUMO is, like the rest of the game, quite simplistic, although it's quite Tron-like as well in how it works. You start off as a character, you can have some customization on whether they're male or female and what colour they are, and you're going to a game jam, nice and simple. And aside from just going through and looking at some of these little other games and displays and retro arcade machines, you get to one at the back and you're sucked into a game world, and this is where LUMO really starts. You become a wizard in the game, almost in appearance like Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, and while you're not really given any story or context beyond that, all you have now is that you're stuck in the game and you're going to need to keep going forward in order to get out. It's quite simple, and the world of LUMO exists as a kind of dungeon in itself that you just keep progressing forward, and more modifiers are added onto the design in order to make it harder for you to progress. You start out very much like in a dungeon, almost like Dark Souls, and you keep going forward where the game shows you all the little bits and pieces you need to be looking out for. You're shown that there are keys for doors you have to collect, and you're shown that there are areas you can get to, but there's no physical way to reach them at the moment, along with little collectibles like cassette tapes and ducks you can see but at this time can't actually get. So you make your way around until you find your first ability of the game, the jump ability, and this is where everything starts to fall into place. Now, going back that same route, everything isn't the same. All those things you can now collect, and with a little bit of trial and error you can work out that ducks are only collectible if you can jump on them but also exit the room in order to save that progress. progress, which means that aside from just completing a room, you also have to be able to collect something in a room and get out as well, which means there's another aspect into how you progress a room if you want to go for collecting upgrades, and that secrets as well aren't just as simple as them being telegraphed. Invisible doors are everywhere, and sometimes you've just got to make a Hail Mary and see if you can actually make a jump or there is something hidden there. Dying in this game is encouraged in order to progress. There's a lot of stuff here that's going to make you die over and over again, and you're going to just have to roll with the punches. If you're playing on the standard difficulty, then it's not really a big problem anyway, because lives are an infinite and there's only really a hardcore difficulty for those of you who want the hardest of challenges, and again, we'll talk about that later. But thankfully LUMO does keep it quite simple with the addition of little puzzle rooms here and there. LUMO is never afraid to introduce a homage to an original game or try something different. If a room isn't about platforming, it's a puzzle to some extent, and in this way it kind of feels like the Crystal Maze too, in that every room can be its own challenge, where it could be reflecting lasers on mirrors, it could be a cannon that you have to hit a target with. You could have to jump over things, you could have to jump under things, you could have to swim. Swimming is introduced later in the game too. And the way it does keep introducing more and more things to make it harder, it's as well as being quite clever, but also a bit of a big FU to the player too, as the game wants you to know that it's consistently going to make it harder for you. Ironically too, there is a little bit of a mid-game twist with LUMO too. In order to progress, you're going to have to actually revive a ghost or some sort of wizard or necromancer or something that's actually encased in stone when it comes to later on in the game, and it's interesting that the game actually chooses to throw a mid-game villain at you. Up to that point, your progression has really been at your pace, and now all of a sudden you do have something of a threat that chases after you. And while it's played for laughs, it does actually make an interesting idea that all of a sudden the game does actually change, and while that does change from room to room, I suppose it's just another element of the modifier that the game has. Up until that halfway point, you would have dealt with all sorts of traps that are all medieval based, but the game introduces tech-based things as well as it goes on. While it seems simple and medieval in approach, you're going to find suddenly you've got electric floors and fans and floating platforms and light sources and water and currents to deal with too, as well as opening doors naturally to progress, whether they be more technical or the more standard door that you've just got to unlock with a key. The way you're actually introducing the game to every kind of puzzle you're going to be hit with beforehand is good for helping you get your feet and helping you work out the logic of how you would solve a puzzle in your head. But the game doesn't follow that simple pattern of introduce something, do something simple with it, and then try the harder challenge. It's very much a case of we introduce this and then you have the hardest version of that puzzle before you move on to something else. And later on in the game as well, you're even left with the introduction and the crazy puzzle within the same aspect of the room. It's really made for those high cognitive days. You really have to get yourself into the mindset that playing this kind of game back in the past, there was no internet. You couldn't just dial up even and just go and get a solution for a room or a puzzle. You could work out what you needed to do, or you had no clue. Sometimes simple platforms can be absolutely insane to work out with the simplest of puzzles, and sometimes it's just finding the right logic and the right way to come at it when the actual solution itself is rather simple but just beyond your grasp. And LUMO is full of major instances like that. But getting back into the progression of the game itself is divided into 4 essential areas that are each bookended by one piece of a device you're supposed to collect, and completing this digitized toolkit is what allows you to essentially end the game. The whole game itself is just a collectathon anyway, with extra little bits hidden too. Around every corner is a reference to older video games and stuff that you may or may not be familiar with, and sometimes these are just simple things like posters on a wall, and sometimes they're first and foremost part of the gameplay. Later on in the game you get a full-on Pac-Man reference as well, with a level you have to play out, which is quite interesting. And throughout the game too, you're encouraged to collect coins that you can use to open one of 6 special zones. Each one of those zones have a gameplay based on an old retro arcade style game. But getting back onto the ghost-like necromancer you meet early on, in a very little chase scene that makes it think like this is going to be the standard formula for the rest of the game, you have a little Lord of the Rings montage where you try to do a you shall not pass, but obviously ghosts float, and all you really do is destroy the bridge you're standing on, sending yourself into a plummeting depths and needing to climb back up again. It's through this little bit and happenstance that the game's humour really starts to take fold with how it handles these villains. There is no direct confrontation with them at any point, and most of the times if you interact with them it's in cutscenes, and for that reason it's played for laughs as well. All threatening credibility of the villain is lost in that Lord of the Rings scene as well, and lets you know that it's really just about having fun and really honouring those old stereotypes too. And I'm quite happy to move on for that. It just becomes a little blip on your journey to escape the game, and it's a nice bit of fun. Ultimately, the final area of the game is just a few of the absolute hardest platforming situations you're going to find yourself in, where you have 4 different routes you can go through, and you have to go through all 4 to reach the end of the game and finally win. By this point, however, you've not only gone through simple basic platforming, more extreme platforming sections, but the game introduces ice as well later on in the game, which makes for some of the worst controlling platformers I've ever seen. It's not so much a case that it wants to make everything harder for you by just throwing stupid modifiers to make everything harder in the precision aspect. Precision in LUMO is kind of a weird thing anyway, very much like the old style arcade games and retro games of the time, is that it's a lot harder to line up jumps than you would think, although on LUMO you're not stuck with the standard 4-way or 8-way direction, although you can use them too. And you can edit your control scheme to make these things harder, but it really feels like the camera and the depth that will be the source of many of your problems until you line up something, leading to a lot of trial and error progress in some of the rooms in the later half of the game. While the ice can make a lot of things harder, it's actually more the effects driven puzzle stuff like floating platforms and fire and spikes. When it comes to the boundary boxes of these things and the characters, you never quite know when you're going to touch them and cause your character to die, which makes it infinitely infuriating times when you spend over an hour in the room only to find out it just loops back to somewhere else you've already been, and you could have taken a different route there in the first place. The end game of LUMO is very much like that, and for that reason a lot of the people I know who've played it haven't actually finished it. I persisted through, and I do have a habit of actually taking on these more harder than life challenges, but even I found myself quite annoyed with the latter half of LUMO and how unfair it seems at times, and how it really felt like it didn't want me to progress, or it wanted to punish me as much as possible to kind of make sure I had the tenacity and the willingness to actually push through and finish the game. It's ironic as well that because the game is a collectathon, there is no actual final boss or final confrontation of any kind. You make the final piece of the puzzle, your little device is correct, and you manage to de-res yourself out of the game, and with that the game ends when your character, now fully human again, legs it from the game jam as far as possible. And I suppose that's kind of interesting, that while the game is very much about you and you have control, it's not you. You don't have any actual control over what the character does, there's nothing in cutscenes, and when you're back in the real world your character just runs away almost in a scared like manner, and I suppose that does make sense even if there's no actual dialogue behind it. What little narration there is in the game is told through mime, and that is very much told through the villain for those few little bits you have. He actually has a personality, which is the only thing in the game that does have personality really. Even then, when the villain splits up into 4 separate pieces as well, he then loses his personality too, and it's an interesting aspect that's brought up for a few minutes and then just drops in a later scene, which is something I would have liked to have seen expanded on a bit more. In that respect really as well, it's not like a game that tries to do a big overarching story. The characters of LUMO are pretty much set down to just 3 really, and even then one of those characters is just a sub-character of another. We have your basic wizard, that's you. I say wizard, but that's very much what it looks like, as you get a staff later on that allows you to actually affect light too. And that's not actually for shadow puzzles, that's more for just stopping spiders from attacking you and making invisible ledges glow, and that's about the extent of it really. You have the big necromancer, and then you have the 4 individual ghosts that are split up from the necromancer when you hit him in a cutscene. That seems like the only reason for it is to have the big Pac-Man homage level. Although I think this is what LUMO makes it its finest, that it keeps things small and concise and allows everything to expand around that. The gameplay is generated from that you have very few options available to you. You either have to jump your way or you have to have some sort of light-based solution, and that's even for the second half of the game. Perhaps the first 2/3 of it are only jumping-based solutions. It's all platforming-based with a few other little challenges that get sprinkled here and there based on other little bits and pieces in other games. The minecart experience later on is a good 5-minute sequence that really feels like it breaks up 2 halves of the game, and it's one of those little bits that I really do enjoy and I wish it was used several times over. If anything, when it comes to this and the room design of LUMO, it does feel like a jack of all trades at times, which is great, but it brings up some really good concepts sometimes that just aren't used again. They're not expanded on, as I said earlier. You get something introduced and then you see the most infuriatingly hard form of it and then you move on. You don't get incremental changes on these or additions to them, or various concepts being merged later on into other things as well, which would work really well and might make for other interesting, extremely hard endgame challenges, which I feel like the game wasn't really shying away from anyway, so why not try a few of them and bring some of these old concepts back? So let's analyse the gameplay just a bit further. Obviously by this point you've seen the video and you've seen it, it's a standard isometric style gameplay. You do actually have some control on the camera. You can normally angle it 5, maybe 10 degrees to either the right or the left to help you line up a few jumps, but ultimately I never really found this helpful. It is worth just keeping on that standard 45-degree isometric look, and that's what makes the challenge anyway. It's all about the jumps and the lining up. And most of the time that's what you're doing. You're either pushing a block into a position to jump from it, or you're jumping on top of a block, and various other things as well. It always takes a bit of trial and error to find out what's actually something you can touch and what's not, but most of the time it's rather well telegraphed with modifiers added on top of this. Some boxes come to life, some of them will follow you around like they love you. It feels slightly companion cube-esque in design, but it's all about how you bring these objects together in order to find a solution to each room you come across. And it's not like you're having a linear progression from one room to the next. You have sections that you move around from one room to the next until you can move on to the next section, and therefore one solution might require you to cross a room several times, and you might find that challenges differ between what direction you're coming at a room from too. It's quite interesting, but everything is based around where you enter and what the things do once you get in there. Most puzzles won't actually start activating if there's movement elements to them until you actually start walking yourself, and it gives you a little idea and a little bit of time to just judge the gauge of the room and see what you're up against before you start moving and find out not everything is as you see. And just like those old retro style games, you have a lot to collect in this game too, and each collection kind of requires something different. Your standard pickups include coins, which is simple enough, and the ducks I mentioned earlier, which you have to jump on and you can bounce off of when needed to reach other areas too. You have to exit a room once you've collected the duck, however, to actually keep it, and there's 30 of them that all have different sorts of challenges with them too. The hidden tapes in the game as well, and the game never actually tells you how many of them, and given how crazy they are hidden around the game, I'm fairly certain that I don't have all of them myself yet, as much as I've tried, and I was quite amazed to find out that I found over 2/3 of the actual secrets throughout my run of the game, a lot of which I wasn't actually looking for, but once I learned that there could be secrets anywhere, I really felt the need to double down and experiment with them. And of course we have our 6 special dungeons in the game, special challenges that really pile on it thick. You're introduced to the first one automatically, as once you fall from the Lord of the Rings parody bridge, you actually fall into this special zone and you can pick one of the 6 to do. Outside of that, you need to collect one of 50 coins in order to actually enter special gateways that are hidden throughout the rest of the game from that point, and they're all homages to different games, or at least different styles of genres in their own way. They're all the hardest versions of them too. Some of them work like Gradius or old twin stick shooters which you have to shoot in order to progress, others are extremely hard platforming, and I think the worst of it is a backwards Marble Madness style level that the only way I was able to conquer in time was to put my controller upside down and control it that way, which meant the inverted controls were no longer inverted and will allow me to actually hack my way down the level with the time limit. Yes, there's time limits to these challenges too, and it makes it even harder knowing that you only actually get one try at each one in order to actually do it, and therefore if you want to do all of these special challenges, you're either looking at a lot of practice time or a lot of play time, and probably a lot of headaches to go along with it as well. But they're all fantastic callbacks to other games, and I think LUMO is great for actually including them. More hat tips to other games and more hardcore challenges for a game that's made up of hardcore challenges. But LUMO at its most basic is a love letter to all these retro designs and games, and this is why we have the inclusion of more real life stuff as well. It's why we have that old aesthetic Tron-like way of something getting sucked into another world. It's almost 80s in design as well. Lots of those old games and actual films worked in the same way, and we have the inclusion of real life objects and locations and games and memorabilia as part of it too. As I mentioned earlier, the Raspberry Pi, SD card, references to other games like Pac-Man, Snake Rattle and Roll, and Saberwolf, and all those really old style games, whether good or bad, they feel like they're all referenced here. But the game itself, and at least the art of the game, never really feels like it merges well, and I always wonder if this is something as well that's very much intended to be like those old games. Obviously graphics have come away since then, but the art of LUMO is basic and at times not even uniform within itself. I don't know if that's by design to just make something quick, or it was a limitation of a small amount of people working on it, or it's just they wanted it to look like an old game that's out of place, a game out of time, which LUMO very much is. It's something that has that difficulty of the past games, but I can't tell if they wanted to have that difficulty feel like those old games for that reason, and they chose not to evolve and make some parts easier, or it's just an extension of having so much extra control that it adds more difficulty where there really shouldn't be. Your basic puzzle elements are fairly simple, and everything progresses well from basic platforming to slight physics puzzles introduced within that, the physics of the ice that's moving on that, and then it comes from air and water as you see elements with fans and things blowing you around and making bigger jumps, and again all very crystal maze in design and labyrinthine too, as I said. But this is where it brings it to the more annoying part of the game, the difficulty itself. Camera difficulties are fundamental because it can be hard to line jumps up. If you're using analog stick to control it, it's so easy to slightly be a couple of degrees off that you might find yourself slipping off a platform or not making a jump when you really feel like you should. Swinging from ropes and riding on platforms becomes some of the most late game annoying things in this whole game, and was nearly the thing that actually caused me to quit. And I feel like this is something that should have been made easier. It can be just so hard to line this stuff up, and The physics-based stuff like ropes as well can be very fickle and it's really annoying. And I know that it took a good long while for pure 3D based and even isometric platforming to really get perfected. Games like Crash Bandicoot came along and nailed it, but that was a good few decades on, and when gaming was at its earliest, very few games actually managed to perfect this stuff well. And obviously the old style of arcade games were really meant to cause people to die constantly and need to continue because they were trying to make money and have people put money into arcade machines to do them. But this isn't about it. LUMO shouldn't be about that. It should be allowing you to progress and not feel like the difficulty is because of the game. More specifically, the depth perception. I think this is where the game falls apart for me, and I honestly don't believe that when I go back and play old retro games and emulators, depth perception is as much of a thing, because it feels like everything is quadrant based in how you move. It's not like you're smoothly going from one bit to the next in a massive location. It's more of each frame feels like you're moving a percentage of the screen, and for that reason I feel like it's easier to line up stuff like that, and LUMO has no simpler equivalent. By giving you more control, it's actually making the game experience harder, and that's a very interesting way to look at it. And it's contrary to almost everything that's happened nowadays, because I feel like giving you more control over something should never be a way of making something difficult, and in most circumstances that would never be the case. Consider the tank control system of the original Resident Evil game. When we got to the remake recently and we were given analog controls, it completely breaks the game for how much easier the game actually becomes, and that takes an element of difficulty with it. And ironically, LUMO is just the inverse of that, which is actually really odd and baffling to an extent as well, and I think certain things should have been in place to stop stuff like that happening. But at its core, I think everything about LUMO just screams retro, and that's by no means a bad thing. And in this day and age, just like Dark Souls, we are seeing a return of all these old style, old guard retro series of games restored and remade in some other way that honours them. I don't know if it does enough to evolve the formulas, but you can say that about other games too, and I think that LUMO at the very least honours what made those games great, and true if those games were either bad or good, and that's what makes it great. But it does evolve the basic fundamentals. Control is still evolved whether it works or not, and the music is very much evolved and feels all very retro-y and great too, and does fit within the world, and there are a few soundtrack highlights as well within LUMO that really stand out, especially when you get an upgrade and you get that big beat that lasts for the next few rooms. That is something that's certainly fun and always worth listening to, but outside of it just feels like effects from yesteryear giving a new upgraded look to make them look better, and this pretty much is the same for everything. The walls, the ceilings, the character designs, and the effects as well, fire and water and stuff like that are all interesting, and just like in those old games, it's hard to actually gauge how much of the stage they can take up at times, which makes lining them up even harder. Not to keep going on about it, but I really feel like it's sometimes just having the option to completely rotate a camera to maybe lock on degrees of 45 degrees or look top down just for a few seconds would really help in giving you the more control to really navigate LUMO in a way that would make it so much easier and give you a way to plan around rooms as well when you really feel it you need to. This is because ultimately the challenge to the player is what you choose to make, and I feel like by giving the player the instant ability to respawn at any point, it feels like an easy way of getting around bad design when it comes to it. But LUMO has a super hard difficulty, a 3 lives difficulty that really does hit up the old retro and the nostalgia and kick you right in the teeth with its difficulty too. My first play of LUMO probably had me exceed over 1,000 character deaths, and while I'm more glutton for punishment in taking the extremely hard try not to die challenge, I did this with Limbo in the 5 lives complete the game challenge, and that took a good 10 hours of practice to eventually get through without any trouble. LUMO is this to the hardcore, to the point where I don't think I'm ever going to do it, especially while trying to do all the collectibles and only dying 3 times. It's something that I really just don't want to even bother with my time with, and I feel like only the hardcore need apply there, but back in those old times that's exactly what it would be like, and it's great that they have that option there. Whether you want to take it or not is very much up to you, but they want to say, look, you want to see how games used to be, this is how games used to be, come on, show me what you got. And I don't mind that mentality, and it's a nice little extra feature that I want no part of, but I'm sure there will be people out there, a minority of the player base overall, but there are people there, and this option is for you, and I will probably watch some of these people on YouTube do this or attempt this and congratulate them if they manage to succeed. Ultimately, LUMO is an interesting game. It's retro reborn, but not necessarily evolved, and I feel like that's a valid complaint of Yooka-Laylee as well to an extent too, but LUMO was choosing to make this simple, and evolving isn't always necessary. Sometimes you want to just do a love letter to everything that inspired you growing up, and I feel like LUMO has that in spades. It has that love and it has that passion for those old style games, and for that reason I think certainly if you didn't grow up in that era, LUMO is certainly a way of getting in touch with that old retro sense of gaming. And LUMO is something you could play, and its incredibly difficult retro sensibility is something that for me is the reason why I like it, but it's also the reason why it's flawed to an extent too, and it's what makes it a very interesting proposition as a game, especially to people who aren't natively aware of stuff like this. It's not like you're going to get that Dark Souls experience of sometimes feeling like if you died it's your fault and you're punished heavily for it that way. LUMO is going to be a case of many times you die might not always be seen as your fault. There'll be a lot of times when your progress takes a while because you're stuck in a room because you don't know the solution, etc., but that's par for the course for games like this. Sometimes you may die and you'll die a lot, but it won't always be your fault, and unfortunately rooms like that may just end up where you think, oh well, I've got through this because of trial and error. I don't think that should be the case in any game. Ultimately LUMO just has a few rooms like that, a very small percentage of rooms, but a few that might just be the make or break for the experience for you. If you choose to undertake the challenge that is LUMO, you should certainly give it all, see how it ends up for you, and be thankful that games have evolved since they had in the 80s, because it could have been a lot worse. So there we go, thanks for watching this little review and analysis of LUMO. It's a great game and one that I fundamentally absolutely love, and absolutely believe that no one really probably would have had any interest in having any artwork done before. So in that vein of the LUMO wizard looking very much like Vivi, I've done a Vivi print for you if you want to win that. As I said, giveaway, be a subscriber, leave a comment, and make a constructive comment. Tell me what you think of the videos, tell me what you think of my other videos, talk, say hi, you know, the simple stuff. And I'll see you with the next video that comes along, which will be a merger of both the tokusatsu videos that I'm known for and gaming, as I take a deep dive into the Cloverturn Platinum Studios game Beautiful Joe as the series begins, that I'll be looking at the full breadth of the Clover and Platinum games as well, not video by video because they take a lot of time to complete some of these games, but this will be a series that will be my ongoing thing around other games and such I cover during the time. So if you like Platinum and Clover Studio games like Okami, Godhand, Bayonetta, Vanquish, etc., then I very much hope you enjoy this, and I will see you next time. Thanks again for watching, because it's great to have your support. And just to remind you as well, I'm also around on Twitter, so follow me there too, on Facebook as well. I have an art store where I do all these art prints too, and you can check that out as well, as a link below. And finally too, obviously, should you want to, Patreon and, you know, just donations to the channel. It helps me get stuff, helps me put time towards this, and ultimately as well I feel like you should probably just get some artwork for yourself or something, get something back and support my store there, or, you know, just leave comments. And thanks for watching. Again, as always, I'll shut up now and I'll see you all later.